The sun blazed over the lands of Egypt, reflecting its merciless glare on the waters of the great Nile. The empire was strong, its temples stood majestic, and the pharaohs considered themselves gods. But among all this grandeur, there was a people crushed by the weight of slavery. The Hebrews, once welcome in Joseph's land, were now just servants, bending their backs under the Egyptian whip. It was against this backdrop of oppression that Aaron came into the world. His birth was not accompanied by noisy celebrations or golden records like that of an Egyptian prince. No, he was born into the silence of a people crying for liberation, carrying in their blood the heritage of the Levites, those who would later be the guardians of the sacred. His parents, Amram and Jochebed, knew very well the risks of bringing a child into the world at that time. The Egyptians were already suspicious of the growth of the Hebrew people, fearing that one day they would become too strong. Check out more Bible stories full of emotion by subscribing to the channel now and activating the bell to receive all notifications. If you like the content, feel free to support our work with a donation by clicking on the Thanks a Lot button. You can also become a member of the channel and enjoy exclusive benefits. But Aaron survived. He grew up among his own, sharing the burden of slavery, listening to the laments of his elders and the whispers of hope about a God who had not forgotten his people. He learned early on the language of suffering, but also the strength of resistance. And while his childhood unfolded among the dusty alleys of the Hebrew villages, another destiny was being mapped out for his younger brother, Moses. Moses didn't grow up alongside him. He was torn from his reality and thrown into the river, only to be rescued and raised among the palaces of Pharaoh. Two brothers, two lives separated by fate. But the threads of history were still being woven. At some point, these very different paths would have to meet, because God already had something in store for them. Time passed, and Aaron became a man. His feet knew every bit of Egypt's arid land. His eyes had seen the marks of the whips on his brothers' backs, and his ears were accustomed to the lament of mothers who lost their sons to Pharaoh's decrees. But despite all the pain, he never stopped believing in the God of his ancestors, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who had promised to deliver his people. The years were hard, and Moses was just a distant memory. The brother who had been taken from him as a child, raised among the Egyptians, educated like a prince. The same brother who, one day, fled into the desert and never returned. Perhaps he was dead. Perhaps he had forgotten where he came from. Aaron didn't know. All he knew was that the Israelites were still there, chained to the will of a king who thought he was a god. Then something happened. Like a wind before the storm, the news came. Moses was alive, and more than that, he was coming back. But not as a fugitive, nor as a repentant prince. Moses was returning as a man sent by God himself with an impossible mission to free the Hebrews from slavery. Aaron heard God's voice calling him. It wasn't just any call, it was destiny being fulfilled. God chose Moses to lead, but he chose Aaron to speak. He would be his brother's mouthpiece, the spokesman for the one who had trembled before the Lord at the burning bush. It was a bold, even frightening plan. Pharaoh was not a man who gave in easily. But when God decides to act, not even the greatest of kings can stop him. So Aaron set out to meet Moses. He didn't know exactly how everything would turn out, but one thing was certain. The days of servitude were numbered, and Egypt was about to witness the impossible. When Aaron met Moses in the desert, something inside him stirred. Time had passed. The marks of the sun and sand were on his brother's face, but his eyes had a different fire. Moses was no longer just the Hebrew boy raised as a prince, nor the man who had fled in fear after killing an Egyptian. He had seen God, he had heard his voice, and now he carried a divine command to free Israel from slavery. Aaron listened to every word, and the weight of the call fell on his shoulders. He wasn't a warrior, He wasn't a strategist, but God wasn't looking for human strength. He wanted servants who had the courage to obey. And Aaron, not knowing what lay ahead, decided to trust. The brothers returned to Egypt, and the first thing they did was gather the elders of Israel. Aaron spoke to the people, repeating exactly what God had commanded. And as proof that they were not alone, Moses threw his staff to the ground, and it turned into a serpent. A shiver went through the crowd. This was no simple speech. God was there. But if the Hebrews were amazed, Pharaoh was not impressed. When the brothers stood before the throne, Aaron raised his voice and proclaimed God's words, "Let my people go." The king of Egypt laughed. Who was this God to give him orders? In response, Moses ordered Aaron to throw his staff on the ground. Once again, the piece of wood became a living snake, slithering across the cold palace floor. Pharaoh's magicians did the same, but Aaron's serpent devoured all the others. A warning, a foretaste of what was to come. Pharaoh, however, hardened his heart. He would not free the slaves. He would not bow down to their God. And then the hand of the Lord began to weigh heavily on Egypt. The whole of Egypt trembled before the might of God. The Nile, once a symbol of life, became a river of blood. The Egyptians tried to dig wells to find water, but all they got was mud and despair. Then came the frogs, thousands of them, jumping everywhere, invading the houses, the temples, the beds of the Pharaoh himself. And when the king briefly asked for mercy, Aaron stretched out his hand, and the frogs died, leaving behind an unbearable stench. But Pharaoh's heart wouldn't give in. God didn't stop. From the dust of the earth, Aaron raised his rod and brought lice that covered men and animals. The Egyptian magicians tried to repeat the feat, but failed. "This is the finger of God," they whispered, terrified. But Pharaoh refused to listen. Then came the fourth plague, swarms of flies buzzing and attacking relentlessly. The whole of Egypt was being destroyed before their king's eyes, but he clung to his pride. There were days and nights of terror. Plagues killed the animals, ulcers covered the Egyptians' bodies, thunder and fire came down from the sky in a storm that swept away entire crops. Aaron and Moses stood before Pharaoh time after time, always bringing the same message, "Let my people go." And they always received the same answer, "No." Then came the locusts, which devoured everything that remained. And then darkness. 3 days of darkness, so thick that it was impossible to see an inch in front of your face. Egypt, land of the sun gods, was plunged into darkness like an endless pit. But even so, the king's heart was not broken. It was only when the last plague fell on the land that Pharaoh felt the weight of his refusal. That night, death passed over Egypt, and the firstborn fell silent. But in the houses of the Hebrews, where the blood of the Lamb marked the doors, there was life. The Egyptians' cries echoed through the streets when Pharaoh finally gave in. The people were free. Aaron saw the slaves become pilgrims, leaving their chains behind. The desert wind blew strong as Aaron walked alongside Moses, surrounded by thousands of Hebrews. Dust rose from tired feet, mixing with the smell of freedom. Egypt was now just a distant dot on the horizon, but with freedom also came uncertainty. Where would they go? How would they survive in the desert? Fear began to grow in the hearts of the people, and soon the first murmur spread among the tents. It was then that once again God showed that he was with them. During the day, a pillar of cloud led the way. At night, a pillar of fire lit up the dark sky, showing that the God who had brought them out of Egypt was still ahead of them. But when they reached the shores of the Red Sea, the sound of horses' hooves made Aaron's blood run cold. Pharaoh had changed his mind. His army was advancing, bringing with it the fury of a humiliated king. Despair gripped the people. They were trapped, with no way out. But Moses raised his rod, and the waters of the sea opened up. Aaron saw the impossible happen before his eyes. The wind roared, pushing the waters sideways, and a dry path formed in the middle of the sea. The people rushed across, looking at those liquid walls erected on both sides. As soon as the last Hebrew stepped onto the other shore, the sea closed in on the Egyptians. Pharaoh's army was swallowed up by the waters. Joy erupted in the camp. Men, women, and children sang to the Lord, danced and celebrated the victory. But the trek through the desert had only just begun. Soon, hunger and thirst came. The people, who had sung with joy, began to complain. God then sent manna from heaven and made water flow from the rock. But the people's hearts were fickle, and their faith was as fragile as dust in the wind. So one day, when Moses went up Mount Sinai to receive the tablets of the law, the people looked at Aaron with eyes full of impatience. The silence of Mount Sinai stretched like a shadow over the camp. Moses had been up for days, disappearing amid thick clouds and lightning dancing in the sky. The people looked up, restless, growing impatient by the day. Their leader was gone, and he wasn't coming back. Aaron felt the weight of responsibility. Ever since they left Egypt, it had always been Moses who commanded, who listened to God's voice and brought direction. But now, the crowd turned to him, demanding answers. Moses has brought us this far and left us. Who will lead us now? The voices multiplied. We want a God we can see. Doubt gnawed at Aaron's heart. Should he wait? Ask for calm. But the fear of the people was great, and maybe, just maybe, he could buy time. Unaware that Moses was holding aloft the very tablets written by the finger of God, Aaron gave in to the pressure. He asked for gold. The people brought earrings, necklaces, everything they had. The metal was thrown into the fire, melting into a golden calf. The crowd erupted in celebration. They sang, danced, and offered sacrifices. Aaron saw it, and deep down, he knew something was wrong. But how to stop it now? The people were blinded by euphoria, and he didn't dare interfere. At the top of the mountain, God could see everything. His tone was furious as he spoke to Moses. "Come down, for the people have already corrupted themselves." Moses went down, and when his feet touched the camp, what he saw was chaos. Idolatry had taken hold of the people. Without a second thought, Moses threw the stone tablets to the ground and broke them. His voice echoed with an anger that made everyone cringe. "What have you done, Aaron?" His brother tried to justify himself, but it was too late. The mistake had been serious. Aaron felt the weight of silence after Moses' fury. The golden calf had been reduced to dust, the people punished for their idolatry, but God, in his mercy, did not reject it. Instead, he did something unexpected. He set Aaron and his lineage apart for a sacred role. He would be Israel's first high priest, the man who would enter God's presence to intercede for the people. The days that followed were marked by detailed instructions. The tabernacle was erected, a place where the glory of the Lord would dwell. Aaron was given special garments, an embroidered robe, a breastplate with 12 stones representing the tribes of Israel. On his forehead, a gold plate bore the words, "Holiness to the Lord." God was placing an immense responsibility on him, to be the mediator between the people and the Most High. When the time came for the consecration, Moses anointed Aaron and his sons with holy oil. Sacrifices were offered and the altar was purified. Then something extraordinary happened. Fire came down from heaven and consumed the offering on the altar in front of the whole congregation. The people fell on their faces in reverence and awe. God was there, and Aaron, the man who had once fashioned a golden calf, now prostrated himself as a servant of the living God. But not everyone accepted this authority without question. In the crowd, suspicious eyes watched every detail. Among them were Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, men of renown among the Levites. But they were not satisfied. Why can only Aaron and his sons serve as priests? Doesn't God speak for all of us? The buzz grew among the tents. Korah, Dathan, and Abiram walked around the camp like restless shadows, muttering poisonous words, spreading doubts. Why were only Aaron and his sons allowed to approach God in the sanctuary? Wasn't the Lord in the midst of all the people? Who did Moses and Aaron think they were to put themselves above the others? It wasn't long before the dissatisfied gathered a group. 250 men, leaders of Israel, joined the rebellion. They went to Moses and Aaron, unafraid, ready for a confrontation. Korah, full of boldness, spoke first. "The whole congregation is holy. Why do you exalt yourselves over the Lord's people?" Silence hung heavy in the air. Moses closed his eyes for a moment and then answered firmly, "Tomorrow the Lord will show who is his and who is not." And so the challenge was issued. The rebels were to bring censers and present them before God. If he accepted them, then they would be right. If not, let the Lord himself decide. The next day, the 250 men gathered in front of the tabernacle, each with his censer in hand. Aaron, standing next to Moses, watched. Then the glory of the Lord descended. The murmuring ceased. Moses looked at the congregation and declared, "If these men die a natural death, then God has not sent me. But if the earth opens its mouth and swallows them alive, they will know that they have despised the Lord." Before anyone could react, a crash came from the ground. The ground broke, and in the blink of an eye, Korah, Dathan, and Abiram were swallowed up by the earth, along with their families. The 250 men holding censers were consumed by the fire that came out of God's presence. The camp was filled with fear. But even after such a terrible judgment, the people still hadn't learned. They continued to murmur, and the Lord sent a plague that began to spread among them. Without hesitation, Aaron took his censer, ran into the crowd, and interceded. Wherever he went, the plague stopped. Among the living and the dead, there was Aaron, standing like a true priest. But his journey was not yet over. The desert took its toll on him for his mistakes, and one wrong choice would soon cost him the right to see the promised land. The desert was relentless. The heat burned during the day, the cold cut through at night, and the people never stopped complaining. Aaron had already seen the land open up to swallow rebels. He had already run against a plague to save thousands of lives, but nothing changed. The Israelites continued to murmur, to doubt, to test God's patience. This time it was thirst. Again, the water had run out, and the people surrounded Moses and Aaron like an angry swarm. "Why have you brought us to this desert, to die here?" The voices rose, charged with anger. The same people who had seen countless miracles were now shouting as if God had never done anything for them. Moses and Aaron sought refuge in the tent of meeting. There they prostrated themselves before the presence of God. And the Lord said, "Take the staff and speak to the rock, and it will give water to the people." It was simple. Just speak. But when Moses and Aaron left the tent, something had changed in them. The weight of years, the weariness of murmuring, the burden of leading an ungrateful people, all of this was building up inside them like a barrel about to explode. Moses raised his staff before the crowd. His voice was no longer calm. It was a thunder of frustration. "Listen up, rebels. Will we have to draw water from this rock for you?" Then, instead of speaking to the rock, he struck it with his staff. Once, twice, water gushed out, and the people drank. But in the silence that followed, something was wrong. Aaron knew. God was watching them. Then came the sentence, "You have not trusted me to sanctify my name before the children of Israel. Therefore you will not enter the promised land." The wind blew strongly on Mount Hor, carrying the dust of the desert, whispering secrets that only the mountains know. Aaron felt the weight of the walk. His steps were slow but steady. He knew that this climb would be his last. Beside him, Moses and Eleazar walked in silence. There was no need for words. Their fate was already sealed. The people waited in the valley, looking towards the top of the mountain. They knew that Aaron would not come down from there. The high priest, the one who had interceded for them so many times, the one who had stood between the living and the dead when the plague struck the camp, was now being called for his last meeting with God. Upstairs, Moses removed Aaron's priestly garments with trembling hands. Each piece he took off carried memories of a divine call, of sacrifices offered in the tabernacle, of days and nights serving the Lord. Eleazar, his son, received the garments, the inheritance of the priesthood. Aaron observed everything with a calm gaze. His journey had been long, full of mistakes and successes, but now it was coming to an end. Then, without fanfare, storms or grandiose signs, Aaron lay down and closed his eyes. The man who once fashioned a golden calf, but who also became Israel's first high priest, quietly departed. Moses and Eleazar buried him there among the lonely rocks of the mountain. When Moses and Eleazar came down, the people were waiting for them. And when they saw that Aaron was no longer with them, weeping spread throughout the camp. 30 days of mourning covered Israel. The one who had interceded for them so many times now rested. The camp moved on, but something was different. Aaron was no longer with them. The high priest's absence was felt at every step in the desert, at every sacrifice offered in the tabernacle, every time someone looked at Eleazar wearing the clothes that had once belonged to his father. The people murmured less, mourning still hung in the air, and Moses, even though he was used to losing so many things along the way, felt the weight of parting in his chest. But Aaron's story didn't end on Mount Hor. His name echoed in every generation that followed. His priesthood was not erased with his death, but became an eternal inheritance for the people of Israel. He was the bridge between heaven and earth, an intercessor who, despite his failings, stood before God on behalf of his people. And perhaps that's where his greatest lesson lies. Aaron was not a perfect man. He failed, gave in to pressure, fashioned a golden calf when he should have waited, struck the rock when he should have just spoken. But God, in his mercy, did not discard him. On the contrary, he called him to an even greater purpose. This teaches us that our mistakes don't have to be the end of our story. God sees beyond our failures and invites us to carry on, to get up, to fulfill the call he has for us. We also learn that bearing the responsibility of serving God does not mean being infallible, but rather being faithful. Aaron interceded, ran between life and death, stood in the gap for the people, even when they doubted him. He shows us that sometimes God puts us in positions that we don't seek, but that we need to accept, because our purpose is not in what we want, but in what he wants to do through us. And so Aaron became more than a name in history. He became a symbol of redemption, of weakness transformed into service, of an ordinary man who, between mistakes and successes, had the privilege of walking before the living God and teaching generations about faith, obedience, and mercy. If you liked Aaron's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.